musicy paper in front of me today. So I'll so I'll just start with prayer, and then I'm going to read the passage, and then we'll talk about it. Yeah, Lord, thank you that your word is a lamp unto our feet, and your words are like honey on our lips. You're just everything we need, Lord. I thank you for that song earlier that said, the anchor holds within the veil for everything that we need, Lord. And you really want to talk to us, and you want to show us more, and you want to draw us nearer to you. I thank you that, yeah, you're everything we'll ever need, and help us to glorify you and follow you more nearly and love you more dearly, Lord, today and always. Amen. So, yes, we have finally arrived in the New Testament. Woo! We didn't read the whole thing, Jenny. We're not that good. But we've done a whistle-stop tour through. I think it was about 30 different talks based on the Old Testament, and now we're on to the New. So we're starting today in John, and it's John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. So I'll start by reading that. And I was a bit selfish in that Mary said, "Oh, does anyone want to do it?" And I was like, "No." Because I love this, and I think it really sings, and I thought I just wanted it to be very close to when I actually preach. So I'm reading it from the ESV, and I mean, God's in all translations, but I just do think this is a beautiful translation of it. Yeah. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness, to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me.' And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." So I think this is such a great way to start our journey in the New Testament with the Gospel of John, who, and the writer, we believe, is John, one of the disciples, John, one of the apostles. Now, of course, if you read the New Testament in order, according to how we read it, you'd start with Matthew. And in many ways, Matthew, it really does speak to this like single salvation story, which runs through the whole of the Bible, which is what our series has been all about. Because Matthew starts with the lineage of Jesus. So it places him directly into this story that we've been following, but through his earthly heritage. And then there are the two other Gospels as well that come before John. We've got Mark, which is shorter and snappier, and many believe that that was the first Gospel written, and that Luke and Matthew were based on that in part. Then there's Luke, which I would probably say is my favourite of the Gospels. it's just full of stories, and it really helps you to get to know Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary and Joseph. And in that gospel, that's when we meet Simeon, who I talked about last time. But while all the Gospels have a focus on Jesus, they, of course, all have a clear link to this one salvation story running through the Bible. They've all got quite different approaches. They've all got quite different ways. And I think that this first chapter of John is unique because it takes us right back to the beginning, before we're even talking about a chosen people, back to when the world began. It completely mirrors the beginning of the Old Testament. Genesis. See, John, he gives us like a wide angle view on it all. And he also takes it up a notch in terms of the spiritual side, the spiritual significance of who Jesus was and what he meant to us. So I know that some people can find John a little bit intimidating as a gospel. It feels a little bit more abstract and a little bit harder to grasp with our minds. But I always think if you can fit the things of God really neatly in your head, and you've probably made him a bit too small, having a sense of wonder is really essential to our faith, I always think. So this first passage of John, it places Jesus right there from the very beginning. And it helps us a little bit because I think sometimes people can struggle with the idea of Trinity. So people talk about the Trinity. People think, oh, when did people start talking about that? Where did that even start? But actually, when you look at the first chapter in Genesis, it starts in the beginning, God. And then it refers to the Spirit of God, which was hovering over the face of the waters. And then John now explains that Jesus was the word by which God spoke everything into being, saying, through him all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. So he's saying that Jesus is the word, but he's also saying that the word is God. And that's informed our understanding of the Trinity, where God is Father, and God is the Son, and God is Spirit. So this phrase, the word of God, that John chooses to use, is full of meaning. It would have really resonated with all different people who listened to this. So in Greek philosophy, the word, or logos, whatever, referred to the principle of order and knowledge. And it was this idea that there was like a rational principle governing the cosmos. And then in the Greek Jewish context, this word was associated with divine wisdom and the intermediary between God and the world. So John was really linking these ideas together, that there was this big rationale and it's centered on one person. And so he was speaking in a way that would have made sense to Jews and to Gentiles. Now, verses 4 and 5, I think, are really, really beautiful. And they've given believers comfort and courage all through the years. So John writes here, in him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And John speaks about this idea of life and more than just, I've talked about this before, where people can be like, oh, well, that's life. Or they say worse things about what life is. But actually, life is so much more than that, and life is a gift. But as a Christian, this word life and what we learn about it, particularly in John, is a game changer. Because we don't merely believe in something with our heads, and we don't follow someone who's outside of ourselves. As believers, we have new life, and that life is Jesus, and he lives in us. I've got back into Watchman Nee recently, so you're going to get a load of quotes from Watchman Nee from now on, because we may as well just have a recording of him talking from the front and we'd all be set right for the rest of our lives. But he says this about that life. He said, God makes it quite clear in his word that he is only one answer to every human need, his Son, Jesus Christ. In all his dealings with us, he works by taking us out of the way and substituting Christ in our place. Son of God died instead of us for our forgiveness, He lives instead of us for our deliverance. So we can speak of two substitutions: a substitute on the cross who secures our forgiveness, and a substitute within us who secures our victory. So we're right to rely on Jesus for our salvation, for our forgiveness. But then sometimes we forget that we're supposed to rely on him for our lives as well. And it's okay if you're not doing very well on your own because you weren't supposed to. It's his life in us that can bring that victory and can be full life that he talks about. So then we go on to verses 6 to 8. And this is where John the Baptist is introduced. And I realized that when I talked about from Malachi last time, I didn't really touch on John, but in Malachi and in so many other verses in the Old Testament, John the Baptist is talked about in advance. And he's a really clear link between the Old Testament and the New Testament. His role in God's big plan was foretold a long time before he came along. And then it was lived out in accordance with those prophecies when he was there. And I think these verses, they give us a really great description of John the Baptist. It says, he came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. And when I was reading this time, it kind of made me think about it afresh. It struck me in a new way that I thought, what a really wonderful description of someone. How amazing would it be if that's how people described us? Isn't that our role as believers? Yes, there's beauty in every believer. You know, we're all made in the image of God. We are children of God. But when we start to think about the light that we carry as something of ourselves, or we use it to bring glory to ourselves, then we are in danger of distorting that light, of getting distracted. Sometimes by like circular struggles we have with ourselves of thinking we're doing well and then not living up to it. Or of letting pride come in, which only leads one way. To be able to testify to the light is an honor and a privilege. And I really love this verse, this part in this passage where it says that light will not be overcome. That light cannot be put out. We're back to Watchman Nee again. So just finished reading his biography. So Watchman Nee was a Christian in China. He was a missionary to his own people. So he, where I was. I've read his biography, and it's really interesting because the way he talks about Christians who are really carrying God's light and reflecting God, he called them lighted Christians. And I thought that was really nice, a lighted Christian. And then as you read the book, it starts off pretty exciting and it goes pretty well. And then the last couple of chapters are just like being punched in the stomach quite a few times. It's quite heavy reading towards the end. So he was imprisoned under the communist regime, and nobody saw him for about 5 years. And then there was a trial. But it's really interesting because when people did manage to see him when he was imprisoned, they said he still had the light in him. He was still the same. He was worried about other people, but he still had the light. And the guy who wrote the book, he even thinks, so he can't be sure because everything was so quiet and controlled and information didn't really move around. But he thinks that the reason why Watchman Nee wasn't released as by a ransom from outside the country, which other people had been, and someone who was as well known as him could have been, was because he chose not to be. He thinks that he did not want to cast any shade on Jesus by taking an out which would reflect badly on Christians and Christianity in China. And that he didn't want to be seen to be confirming that, the communist regime had alleged that he was corrupt and that he was working for the West as a spy, and he didn't want to give any more fuel to that. He served China faithfully and the demands of the Communist Party in every area that didn't contradict his faith. And I just thought such a testament to that light and that life inside someone that cannot be overcome by evil, that is not overcome by darkness. And then we move on to that part where the sad comments about the fact that Jesus came to his own, but they didn't accept him. And obviously this was written by John, who'd been there, who was a Jew, who'd seen all this coming. And obviously a lot of people had believed, but a lot of people hadn't. And they think he was writing this at a time, this is a really evangelistic book. He is trying to convince people. So he saw what that was like. But then straight after that, we get this lovely promise. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believe in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. That's a really wonderful promise to hold on to. And I was struck this time reading it, actually, that description of the children of God being born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God, is both a good description of us as, the new life that we have when we believe in God. It starts today. When we put our trust in Jesus, it starts on the day that we do that. But also, it describes Jesus, doesn't it? It describes Jesus and his life on earth and his beginning, where he came from. And it just reminded me of that. It says in the Bible that he was the firstborn of all creation, and we are his brothers and sisters. So we're being conformed in his image. So it makes sense that we would have the same new beginning as he had. Now, the way that John describes Jesus' coming, he emphasizes that he existed already, but then he became flesh. He became man. And as we know, John knew him, so he would have seen this. He saw this side of Jesus. And then he says that he made his dwelling among us. And that can be translated to he tabernacles with us. And for those who remember, I've talked before about the tent of meeting, that God would meet with Moses in the tent of meeting. That was where God met with Moses. And then they had the temple, and that was where God would meet with his people. And then you've got Jesus. It's the new tabernacle. And he was where people met with God. Because he was God become flesh. As it says in verse 18, the one and only Son, who is himself God, and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. And I was really reminded, actually, it's good that Mary put the song Cornerstone on today, because my friend Karen has just done her prayer walk from New York to Washington, D.C. And when she was doing it, she walked there's cornerstones for Washington, D.C. So she walked them. And she really, one of the things she wrote, because she kind of writes up her thoughts and what she feels like God's saying. And she said that one of the things she felt was that we've got to have Jesus as our cornerstone. And that cornerstone is the first one. It's the one that, like, everything else is built on. And you can't start without it. That Jesus has to be our cornerstone. Because actually, we're very good at misunderstanding God. There's a quote that I think of all the time, and it says, in the beginning, God made man in his own image. And ever since, man has been returning the favor. But in Jesus, there's no excuse. When we look at Jesus, he is the full reflection of God. And you can't but humble everybody. You can't really rant at people when you've just read the words of Jesus, because you're just thinking about what he's saying to you, actually. But it just made me think of that he is he's just the fullness of God, and he helps us understand what God is like. And that's such a gift. Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promises in the Old Testament, the fulfillment of the law of Moses. He's the fulfillment of the promises about the temple. He's the fulfillment of the promise that God would be with his people. And the way that John describes him, he says he's full of grace and truth. And he says that twice in this passage. And that is the equivalent in the Old Testament of how God spoke about himself. He said he was abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. It's the same as full of grace and truth, just showing that they are the same. Now, over the Christmas holidays, I prayed to see if God would give me a verse for the year. I find it quite helpful. Sometimes I've had a verse or a passage that I felt like I'm going to pray into and look into this a bit through this year. And often they really like resonates with lots of things that happened that year. So I've really felt that helpful, and I've missed it when I haven't done it. So I prayed about it this year, but I didn't get a verse this time. I just got a word, and the word was fullness. So I've started to look through the Bible and all the time the word fullness comes. And what does that mean in the Bible? What is God trying to say to me? And another time I hope to speak a bit more with you, because I think that God's got something to say to us as a church from the book of Ephesians. So it talks about the fullness in that. It talks about the fullness of the church being received out of the fullness of Jesus. And it's to do with unity, and it's to do with using our gifts. So I will come back to you on that one another time. But anyway, for the purposes of today, I was excited to see that the word fullness was in this passage as well. Because in verse 16 it says, "For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace." And my kids laugh at me because I'm a Bible geek. Just in case you didn't know this, I am a Bible geek. I've got this big book. Well, I've got Strong's lexicon, and it's got all the words in it. And they were like, "All the words in the Bible." I was like, "Yes, all the words in the Bible." And then like some other lexicons that go with it. And then for Christmas, I got a book of all the names in the Bible. So if you ever want to look that up, let me know. So yeah, and they're not even teenagers yet. Goodness knows how much fun they're going to make of me when they're teenagers. But anyway, I was looking in this book at the word fullness. And it says that it's used in the New Testament to denote the state of being full or complete. And it often refers to the totality or completeness of something, whether it be the fullness of time, the fullness of God, or the fullness of Christ. And it says that the term conveys the idea of something being brought to its intended purpose or capacity. And I thought, isn't that just what we're looking at in this series? That fulfillment of those promises of God. And isn't that just what we're looking for in our lives, our Christian lives? That fullness that God offers us and the fulfillment of what he's spoken over us. And, it's just the fact that sometimes we forget that, but we live in a time where we've received of the fullness of God's promises, and his intended purposes, because they came in the person of Jesus. And when we receive him, we receive from the overflowing of his fullness, grace upon grace, it says. And that grace, it's like, it's that favor that we just don't deserve, and that kindness of God towards humanity. But it's also all those blessings. It's more than just the forgiveness, it's the living as well. It's overflowing. And I was thinking about it. I was like, when people say, "What a time to be alive," and they always mean it in a bad way. But I was thinking, what a time to be alive. And I just, for myself, I'm going to try to commit this year to really seeking out all that means for ourselves and for the church and for our world. And I invite you to do the same as well. So I'll just finish with a prayer. Yeah, Lord, thank you. There are, in some ways in the Bible, you say that we will have trouble. But you say, don't worry, because you've overcome the world. So help us not to get so distracted with the struggle that we don't remember what we've already received, that you've already overcome, actually. And I pray that you'd help us to understand that. I pray that you'd help us to walk in that kingdom. Lord, we pray your kingdom come and your will be done. Help us to start walking in that now. Thank you for the times when we have, and we've seen it. But we want more, God. We've got so much more to offer. And we thank you for that. We thank you for who you are. Thank you for who you showed us you are in your Son and what you mean to all of us. Just be glorified in us. Amen.